Fires that change Woodstock Streetscape. Like many towns, Woodstock has experienced its share of fires, shaping its history and its streetscape. Today we'll take a look at a few notable fires and their lasting impact on the town. Woodstock's earliest recorded fire occurred around 1774. It affected the area that includes what is now Woodstock's Green. Before the fire, this plain was covered in dense white pine and spruce. According to Mrs. Howland, who moved to Woodstock in 1774, this fire had taken place shortly before she arrived and had left behind a desolate and ghastly landscape. While the land's charred appearance may have been bleak, it does not appear to have deterred settlers. Just 12 years later, in 1786, Woodstock had attracted a number of new families and was given the coveted designation of being the shire town or county seat of Windsor County. As the county seat, Woodstock required a courthouse, which was built near the green on the general site of where the Lyman Mower House now stands. Unfortunately, this early courthouse burned down in 1791. While the cause of the fire is still not known, at the time of the event, a young man named Cato Boston was suspected of having started the fire. Cato had been brought to Woodstock in 1772 as a 10-year-old enslaved African-American child. 19 years later, at the time of the fire, Cato was about 29 and would have been emancipated based on the terms of Vermont's 1777 Constitution, which abolished slavery for men over age 21. It is not known if race played a part in the arson charges that were brought against Cato. However, these charges were ultimately dismissed due to lack of evidence. With the loss of Woodstock's first courthouse, plans for a new courthouse were soon underway. The second courthouse was completed in 1793 near what is now the Middle Bridge on the Green. While its primary purpose was as a legal center, this courthouse also served as a venue for everything from town meetings to lyceums and singing schools. The second courthouse's central role in the community undoubtedly made the loss of this building even more devastating after a fire broke out on July 4, 1854. That Independence Day was a hot one, with thermometers registering 95 degrees in the shade. According to Oscar Farwell, who was a child living in Woodstock Village at the time of the fire and who witnessed the burning of this courthouse firsthand, most of the town's men were to the south of the village celebrating when the fire broke out, and only 2 adult men were initially at the scene to help. The local papers made no mention of this delay at the onset in mobilizing efforts to put out the fire. Rather, the local papers reported that for 3 hours, men, women, and children fought off the flames, while the town's fire engine companies worked tirelessly, raising water over 50 feet from the nearby Ottauquechee River. Despite such Herculean efforts, the courthouse burned to the ground. Surprisingly, the fire and the loss of this public building was not front-page news in the Vermont Temperance Standard. Instead, page 1 of this local paper was dedicated to warnings about alcohol. News of the fire was reported on page 2, where the newspaper states, "The fire was undoubtedly occasioned by an India cracker thrown upon the roof or discharged within the tower by certain headstrong, lawless boys whose rule and authority has long been supreme in our village." 6 years after the burning of the courthouse, there was another major fire that shook the village. This one occurred on February 10, 1860, and it devastated Edson's Row, a major commercial district on Central Street. Following this fire, the Vermont Standard reported, "We were visited on Friday last with a most destructive fire in which a large portion of our business community are sufferers. At about 8 o'clock in the morning, smoke was seen issuing from the attic of that portion of Edson Block occupied by Russell and Clark and N. Haskell, and in spite of the utmost exertions of our fire department and citizens, at about 12 o'clock noon, the greater portion of Edson Block and storehouses, barns, etc. adjoining, to the number of 5 or more, were in ruins. The buildings that were destroyed were described as old, dry, and lightly built, which caused the flames to spread rapidly, giving shopkeepers little time to remove their goods. Some of the merchants whose businesses were impacted by the fire quickly rallied, as shown in this advertisement, placed about 6 weeks after the fire. Joel Eaton, the owner, may have lost his store, but he hadn't lost his sense of humor. He wrote, "Fire, fire, fire, burnt out but not disheartened." The warm spell of February 10th, having compelled the subscriber to move to better quarters to keep his large stock of goods from spoiling, is now prepared to see his old friends and customers and the public generally at his new place of business on Parks Alley, Central Street, where he is selling fireproof and waterproof boots, shoes, and rubbers at unusually low prices. We do not have any photos of the fire or its immediate aftermath. However, we do have photos of the rebuilding of the burned blocks. By the following year, the replacement buildings were completed. The new block was called the Phoenix Block because it had been rebuilt so quickly that it seemed to arise from its ashes like the mythical phoenix bird. Just across the street from the Phoenix Block was Henry's Hotel, formerly known as Barker's Hotel. This large building was originally constructed in 1796, and over the years a number of additions and L's had been added, making it a dominant feature of the village square. However, on March 23, 1867, the building, with its multiple additions, caught on fire and was completely destroyed. The hotel was valued at $9,000, and the personal property contained within, that included 3 horses, totaled an additional $5,000. It was a huge loss as the building was only insured for $7,500. In addition to the hotel, on Elm Street the block also housed a post office, a furniture dealer, a milliner, and noted silversmith R.H. Bailey. On Central Street, the fire destroyed the county jail, which was adjacent to the hotel. The devastation caused by the fire was complete. Only rubble and the remnants of a few walls and fireplaces remained, as shown in this photo, which is taken from the vantage point of Elm Street, looking south toward Mount Peg. This photo, taken from the vantage point of Central Street looking west, shows a close-up of that jail that was destroyed. The loss of the jail was estimated at $4,000. The insurance coverage was only for $3,000. After the fire, several new replacement blocks were built on Elm and Central Streets, which changed the look of the village square. These changes included the construction of some of the quintessential blocks that still make up the downtown district. Looking diagonally across the street from where Henry's Hotel had stood was a 2-story stone building, which was located just to the west of Edson's Row. This building didn't burn in 1860 when Edson's Row caught on fire. However, ultimately, it was not able to escape its fate. It burned 21 years later, in 1881. This photo, taken after that fire, shows the remnants from the building as well as the back of the Tuther House, located at 4 the Green. Today that space has been rebuilt so that it blends in the same general style with the rest of the Phoenix Block. Just across the street from what had been the stone store is a large federal-style home that was built in the 1790s. Although originally raised by Jacob Wilder, it was completed by Titus Hutchinson and was home to the Hutchinson family for many years, as well as reputedly used by Titus Hutchinson as a stop on the Underground Railroad during his ownership. This building was later converted into an inn that was known as the White Cupboard. It was here in this dining room that in January of 1934, 3 young businessmen from New York asked the inn's owners if they would set up a ski tow, similar to one that the young men had seen in Canada. This conversation provided the impetus for one of the first ski tows in the United States, which was located at Gilbert's Hill in Woodstock. No one could have foreseen that just 6 years later, in 1940, a fire caused by faulty wiring in the basement would quickly spread through the partitions of the house to the roof. Note the ladder leaning against the gable end of the building and the massive flames surrounding it. A local newspaper described Leonard Cohen as being, and I quote, atop a ladder at the third-story windows when the flames came right at him. All alone, he was perched above the watching crowd, hose in hand, ready to hit the flames. But hit he could not. There was no water in the hose, and no coaxing would persuade the water pressure to come along and do what Leonard was bound it would. Few will forget the manner of speech he used to inform others of his plight. The building was not the only casualty. George Staples, another volunteer firefighter, suffered a serious back injury when the ladder he was climbing on cracked, and Leonard Cohen, who was at the top of the ladder, fell on top of him. Fortunately, the firemen were eventually able to put out the flames. While severely damaged, the building was salvageable. Today, the exterior of the building looks much as it did before the fire. Continuing north down Elm Street from the Hutchinson House, we come to the site of a building that was not so lucky. Prior to 1971, a large Italianate-style commercial building stood between Gillingham's and a smaller brick building known as the Dana Block, which in the 1800s had been Charles Dana's dry goods store, but in more recent years had housed the Elm Tree Press and several shops. Behind this complex was an extensive barn that had originally been used by the Dana family as an auxiliary building to their brick store, but in more recent years had housed a restaurant. In 1971, a fire started in this complex and swept through the Tracy Block, the Dana Block, and barn, and part of the area used by Gillingham's for storage. Photos reveal the extent of the loss. However, that loss would have been much greater had it not been for the keen eye and quick thinking of a 12-year-old paperboy named Frank Soule, who spotted smoke coming from one of the buildings and reported it, giving firefighters a chance to battle the blaze before all the adjacent buildings were fully engulfed in flames. A year after the fire, the remnants of the Tracy Block building were removed, and the block on Elm Street was replaced with a current, modern-style building which provides a mixed-use space. The Dana Block was repaired and currently has both offices and a restaurant. While the area around the village square had numerous fires, other sections of the village were also reshaped by blazes. On Court Street, where the Woodstock Inn Spa building is currently located, there used to be a grand stable. This stable was built in the early 1900s, and it became a hub for local trail rides, as well as a home away from home for a crew of horse-crazy children who worked around the stable. While this building was in the process of being dismantled, it caught on fire and burned in April of 1963. The newspaper caption reads that the fire was so intense that the building was leveled in minutes. The stable on this site was not the first to burn. 59 years earlier, in November of 1904, another fire on this site had leveled the previous stable. While carriages, sleighs, harnesses, and feed were lost in that fire, luckily the firemen were able to save all the horses. A year before the inn's first stable on Court Street burned, another major fire claimed the Catholic church that stood on South Street, just a stone's throw away from the stable. The Catholic church was made of wood and had been designed by architect George H. Guernsey. In keeping with the Gothic style, this structure featured a tall steeple. On September 1, 1903, the church caught on fire following an evening service. It is not known how or exactly where the fire originated, and while the first visible flames were quickly extinguished, it appears that other flames were burning in the building's partitions that allowed the fire to spread quickly throughout the building. When the firefighters arrived on the scene, they attached their lines to the closest hydrants. However, initially there was not enough water pressure to provide a forceful stream of water. According to the newspaper report, It was not until flames had nearly run the length of the roof to the belfry that a stream of any force was playing on the flames. The fire had then got too much headway, and efforts were then directed towards saving adjoining buildings. One of those nearby buildings was the Catholic Church's parish house, which stood about 10 feet to the north of the church. At first, the church's burning spire and belfry had toppled toward this building, and those watching feared that this burning mass would fall onto the parish house, setting it afire. However, when the northeast post of the church's steeple collapsed, it pitched the steeple toward the street near the entrance of the church, thereby saving the parish house. According to Woodstock resident Frederick Wilder, there was an organ in the Catholic Church, and during the fire, the extreme heat caused the organ to emit a series of discordant sounds while the church was burning. This organ and other contents of the church, with the exception of the sacred vessels and a few vestments, were destroyed. The church, which had been built at a cost of about $8,000, was only insured for $6,700, which didn't include the cost of the furniture, which was valued at an additional $300. The church's congregation and community rallied following this fire, and just over a year later, the stone church, also known as Our Lady of the Snows, was open in time for the midnight mass on Christmas Eve of 1904. During the period between the fire and the opening of the new Catholic Church, the congregation held their services in Woodstock's town hall, which was located just down the street and across the green. The original structure for Woodstock's town hall was constructed in 1899 and doubled as an opera house with a second-floor auditorium that was replete with elegant seats and stage fixtures. On February 15, 1927, a disastrous fire began in the basement of the building and then crept up the stairways to the first floor, where it gutted much of the building's interior. The smoke was described as being so dense and acrid that the lack of smoke mass was perilous, and some firemen were obliged to go to bed for a time afterwards. The damage to the building was originally estimated to be about $5,000. However, by October of that year, estimates for the repairs and changes to the building had ballooned to $50,000. These changes and repairs included moving the music hall to the first floor and having the space for the town offices and meetings on the second floor. The exterior of the building was also altered significantly by the construction of a 12-foot deep entrance porch with a pedimented front supported by 4 massive columns. This new front, according to the local newspaper, was designed to give the edifice an appearance of increased height and substantial dignity, harmonizing well with the colonial character of other village architecture. While some changes were purely aesthetic, many others, such as the construction of firewalls around the stairways, adequate exits at each corner of the music hall, and fire escapes from the second story, were to help ensure that the town hall and the people using the building would be better protected in the future. While there are fewer fires now than in the 19th and early 20th centuries, fire still continues to reshape Woodstock's streetscape. Case in point, on July 16, 2018, a fire engulfed the historic building on Central Street that housed Pie, an area eatery known for its brick oven pizzas. Interestingly, this was not the first fire on this site, an earlier fire having occurred in 1938, which damaged both the building on this site, which was a garage at the time, as well as the stone building next to it. After that fire, the garage building was rebuilt and the top story of the stone building was removed, giving the stone building its current distinctive flat roof profile. Today, to help prevent the start and spread of fires, there are improved materials and building guidelines and improved firefighting equipment. In the place of the bucket brigades and water cisterns from the early 19th century are professionally trained firefighters, fire trucks, hydrants, and some buildings that have built-in fire suppression systems. While these improvements don't provide complete protection from fire, they can help to mitigate the effects of fire and prevent unintentional changes to our streetscapes.